The Grand Alliance was formed in 1941, and it was between Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill. They all agreed basically to destroy Nazi Germany. This doesn't go well originally because basically Roosevelt and Churchill refused to form a second front in Europe, leaving Stalin to basically fight the entirety of the Nazi army on his own, which he's not particularly happy about, to say the least. Now, while the West do supply him with convoys, it's limited. As we move into 1943, the Germans discover the Katyn graves, which is basically the massacre of 20,000 dead Polish officers by the Soviets in 1940. The Soviets don't want an investigation, and so they break ties with the Polish government in exile. As we move into 1944 and 1945, the Soviets begin to conquer Eastern Europe, and using a mix of the Red Army and the NKVD, they systematically stamp out opposition to them. And as a result, the Lublin Poles come into play, and they basically become the government of Poland, and they recognise the Soviet Union, and they don't recognise the government in exile. So there's basically two different governments vying for Poland. Also, this begins to happen a lot in the rest of Eastern Europe as well. Now, in 1944, there's something called the Percentages Agreement. This is basically when Churchill hands over all of Eastern Europe to Stalin in a mix of percentages control of government. Then we have the Yalta Conference in 1945, which is basically about saying that Germany is going to be split into 4 zones. The USSR gets some more territory from Poland, and Poland gets that territory back from Germany. Oh, and reparations aren't decided. And the other thing is this Declaration of Liberated and Free Europe, which is something that Roosevelt comes up with that's amended by Stalin. Then we move to the Potsdam Conference, which is after the Second World War is over. Now, at this point, Churchill's lost the general election. He's replaced by Attlee. Roosevelt's dead. He's replaced by Truman. Truman is a much more fervent anti-communist. The Potsdam Conference doesn't go particularly well. The USSR basically gain all... they have to only take reparations from their zone. They get 25% extra from the other zones, 10% of which is just given, and 15% of which is actually conditional based on supplies of something else. Then we move it to the end of the World Wars, and then the dropping of the atomic bombs, which annoys Stalin because basically they've got this huge big bomb and he doesn't have that, and he feels threatened. So he tightens his grip on Eastern Europe, and he starts wanting Eastern Europe basically under his control. He wants his buffer zone. He wants his satellite states. And this is basically prevent Russia being invaded by Germany again, which is kind of understandable to a degree. Now, originally, basically, the communists take charge in Eastern Europe through a mix of rigging elections, assassinating candidates, arresting them, things like that, until basically in 1948, Edvard Beneš resigns and leaves Czechoslovakia, which is the last remaining communist country, or non-communist country in the East, fully communist. Then there's Yugoslavia, which basically... Tito liberated the country on his own. He doesn't want to share power with Stalin. Stalin eventually kicks him out of the Cominform. In 1946, there's Cannan's Long Telegram, which is basically by George Kennan, who's part of the US Embassy in Moscow. He sends a document basically saying that the USSR and the USA are ideologically incompatible, and the USSR can show that they're better through the growth of capitalism. Novikov, who's in the USSR Embassy in Washington, says more or less the same things, but the Soviets are weaker due to the fact that basically their entire country's been destroyed by the Nazis and the US hasn't. Then there's the Iron Curtain speech by Winston Churchill in 1946. He does a direct attack on Soviet policies because he believes that they're interfering in Greece and also a lot in Eastern Europe. And he says they've gone back on the agreement. And to a certain extent, he compares Stalin to Hitler, which really wasn't a wise idea. And also Truman was with him, which kind of shows deterioration in East-West relations. Then we have the Greek Civil War, which is basically a fight between the nationalists and the communists. Stalin's not behind it, though, because you've got to remember that Stalin only likes communists that are friends with him or support his view. If they don't, then he doesn't like them. The idea of containment kind of springs about limiting communism. Anyway, the Truman Doctrine is launched, which provides basically 400 million to the Greeks nationalists to destroy the communists and 100 million to the Turkish people as well, which is quite important as well. Cominform is established in 1947, which is basically a way of all the parties of all the communist parties of Europe basically meeting, and it's a way of them centralizing control from Moscow. Now, the US's policy in Europe, they become more and more involved because they want to see Europe rebuilt. In 1947, George Marshall sees Europe and basically decides that Western Europe is in danger of turning communist, hence why the formation of the Marshall Plan, which gives Western Europe aid. Now, the problem with this aid is it also ties them to the USA. As part of the conditions of receiving the aid is basically that they have to buy European goods. American goods. In total, this comes to about $13.5 billion in aid. Eastern European states were invited, but Soviet Union forces them basically not to agree to it. In 1947, the British and American occupation zones are formed by Zonia because the British can't cope. And then we move into 1948 and the start of the Berlin Airlift, which is basically due to the fact that the Western powers put the Deutschmark in their zones in Germany, and the Soviets don't because they want a weak Germany. And as there's some in Berlin, the Soviets decide they want to blockade Berlin and force the Western Allies out of their zones in Germany. It fails. Operation Vittles is a huge success and keeps the German people alive. Willy Brandt, who's one of becomes leader of West Germany, is actually the deputy undersecretary to the mayor at the time, and he sees a lot of this, which is also interesting. But basically, it's a huge airlift, and that's what happens. In 1949, after that, the state of West Germany, the FRG is formed, and the GDR, which is the German Democratic Republic, is formed. NATO is also created. NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, ties the US militarily to the Western Europe. Then the Cold War begins to widen. First of all, you have Japan. After 1945, the US basically starts rebuilding Japan. They increase trade. They control price. They basically stop, and they introduce something called a super balanced budget under a banker called Dodge. This leaves a surplus of 100 billion yen, basically in case there's a economic shortfall, and it basically rebuilds Japan's economy. And this is all under the command of Douglas MacArthur. Then you've also got the San Francisco Peace Treaty, which is basically where the USA and Japan finally conclude the war. It means that they don't have to pay. It forced Japan to renounce its territory and get US assistance. It didn't really put significant restrictions. It's a bit weird. Then you've got China. Mao Zedong wins in 1949, beats Chiang Kai-shek, and the Americans were reporting Chiang Kai-shek. Aiken's white paper, a sorry document to well-meaning mistakes, basically says it wasn't the US's fault that Chiang was useless and he lost. NSC 68 comes in after the USSR gained their atomic bomb in 1949, and it basically says the USA needs to spend $100 billion in order to increase their armed forces. Once we get to 1950, the tensions between North and South Korea are going over. In 1950, after gaining cordial support from the USSR and China, Kim Il-sung invades South Korea. Then Douglas MacArthur, also say the USA, take it to the UN, and a coalition force under Douglas MacArthur land at Incheon, force the North Koreans back over the border into North Korea. MacArthur continues into North Korea up until the border of Manchuria. Mao then gets involved, sends the People's Volunteer Army into Korea, fights with the North Koreans, and then pushes the UN coalition forces back. MacArthur wants to use nuclear weapons. He's sacked. Then Matthew Ridgway comes in. They gain a bit of ground, and they basically stabilise at the 51st parallel, which is where the war ends in 1953. The impacts of the Korean War are actually quite deadly to many sides. McCarthyism forms, which basically Joseph McCarthy is a senator who accuses members of the State Department of being communist, and then he's found to be a liar, and that's the main thing. US dominance in the United Nations also comes about during the 1950s because they start thinking about being world policemen. Then we have also the alliances that come up under the Eisenhower regime. The Warsaw Pact is also formed under the Eisenhower regime, which is basically a movement of the Eastern European states, all centralized by Moscow. It's like NATO, but for the Eastern European states. You've also got SEATO, which is the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, which is a bit of a failure, really, because it's got Thailand and Pakistan, which are the only two Southeast Asian countries, really. You've also got the Baghdad Pact, which is for the Middle East as well, and it's basically there to kind of contain communism. Eisenhower, again, comes to presidency in 1952. He ends a career war, the New Look policy. There's containment, which is first combatant domino theory, but there's massive retaliation, which is basically the argument, if the Soviets launch a nuclear strike, we retaliate with greater force. Then there's the NSC 162/2 report, which basically say the most effective way to deter aggression for Western Europe is for the USA to forcefully display its determination of nuclear weapons against an aggressor. Brinkmanship is basically nuclear diplomacy, as in diplomacy up until the edge of nuclear war. As I mentioned, the domino theory before, in French Indochina during the 1950s, the French are fighting a war against Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh, and it's not going well for the French, and it culminates in the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954, which is basically when the French get surrounded by the Viet Minh, and they didn't think that General Giap would bring up a load of artillery up a steep ravine. He does, and basically destroys the French. Their commander commits suicide, and that's that. This gives Ho Chi Minh a huge amount of power at the Geneva Conference in 1954, which basically splits Vietnam in half, with the north side supporting, which is communist under Ho Chi Minh, and the south supported by the US under Diem. Khrushchev becomes leader in 1956. At the 20th Party Congress, he denounces Stalin and basically says that he was a tyrant and de-Stalinization occurs. In Poland in 1956, there begins to become riots and they want to have Gomka in charge. And this is all sparked because pay decrease and more working hours. In Hungary, on the other hand, students in Budapest, they want the appointment of Imre Nagy as Prime Minister. Withdrawal of Soviet troops from Hungary, freedom of speech and that kind of thing. Nagy takes charge and basically wants to withdraw Hungary from the Warsaw Pact. The Soviets don't like that, and so they send in tanks and kill over 4,000 people. and exile a lot of people. That was the main problem. But Khrushchev mainly wants peaceful coexistence with the West, which is quite important. And it's basically partly because he can't fund the armies at all. The Austrian State Treaty of 1955 basically says that Austria is an independent country free of USSR or USA negotiations. Geneva Summit in 1955 is basically where Khrushchev meets Eisenhower. Then there's a visit to Camp David. There's also the Paris Summit with Eisenhower in 1960, although that stopped due to the U-2 spy plane incident where Gary Powers is shot down and the Soviets conclude he's spying in the USA, refused to apologize. Kennedy becomes president in 1960. He's basically bullied by Khrushchev over Berlin in the conference. But Kennedy's already suffering from the Bay of Pigs, which is a huge problem. At this point, there's also the space race. The USSR have launched a satellite and got a man into space by 1961, which is a huge, huge problem. Khrushchev wants to reaffirm the USSR's rights over Berlin, which would have caused a problem with the Hallerstein Doctrine, and he basically wants Berlin firmly under the USSR's control due to the increased number of refugees that are leaving from East to West Berlin. And as a result of basically the West saying no, Khrushchev decides and agrees with Walter Ulbricht, who's the leader of West Berlin, Walter Ulbricht, who's the leader of East Berlin, that they're going to build a wall and prevent people from escaping. The wall eventually grows, there's snipers, landmines, and it basically stops anybody from going. Meanwhile, the conflict in Asia is beginning to brew as well. Ho Chi Minh's reforms in North Vietnam don't go to plan because they're following the Chinese model, and they end up having to apologize. Meanwhile, in South, Diem's nepotism is reaching its pinnacle, and lots of other people don't like it. In 1960, the formation of the National Liberation Front, or the Viet Cong. And basically, this is a group by North Vietnam who seek to destabilize the South Vietnamese regime. But as Diem's corrupt and nepotistic, the NLF actually gained quite a lot of support. Diem's also a Catholic and the country's Buddhist. This in particular is quite important, as in 1963, the Buddhist crisis, basically Buddhist monks set themselves on fire and caused people basically to go against Diem more often. The Strategic Hamlet program in 1962 is also about trying to get rid of the Viet Cong. And eventually Kennedy banks a whole load of military generals to assassinate Diem, which is, again, quite important. Confrontation between the superpowers. This is the other big thing that happens in the early 1960s, the Cuban Missile Crisis. Cuba was originally run by a person called Batista, and then he's overthrown in 1959 by a man called Fidel Castro. And Castro nationalizes a lot of American-owned businesses, and as a result, the US basically cut their import of Cuban sugar by 95%. And as a result, this moves Castro firmly in the USSR's camp, or mainly in the USSR's camp. It does further encourage him to go to USSR with things like the Bay of Pigs, where 1,500 Cuban exiles land in Cuba and are stopped, also Operation Mongoose to assassinate him. Anyhow, due to all these reasons, Castro gets support in the USSR. And one of the ways Khrushchev suggests of maintaining Cuba's independence is to put nuclear weapons there. The USA complain, and then we have the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is basically when the US quarantine Cuba and prevent missiles from going there. There's hawks, which basically want the USA to take a stuffer stance, and there's doves who don't. And eventually this is all solved through diplomacy when the USA agree to get rid of their nuclear weapons in Turkey and northern Italy in exchange for the USSR basically getting rid of theirs from Cuba. It's quite dangerous. It could have been a huge problem, and it's lucky they didn't end a nuclear war, but thanks to a lot of diplomacy on both sides, it didn't. And Cuba remained a communist country. This is really the end of the first part of the Cold War, and thank you for listening.